giving you the insider takes and the big picture view on the Dogs. This is On the Beat, presented by Ingles with DawgNation insider Mike Griffith and Cody Chaffins.
Happy Monday night to you. Cody Chaffins and Mike Griffith with you on the beat. And we look a little different this week. I'm out of the studio. I'm coming to you from Radio Row at the Super Bowl in New Orleans. We've got Super Bowl media night going on tonight. I'm excited to talk to those Philly Dogs, 6 of them, 6 former Georgia Bulldogs on that Philadelphia Eagles defense. Mike?
Well, it's a great week for Georgia fans as well. They get to see some of the former stars of those national championship teams that Kirby Smart had. Kind of reminds you of what Georgia football aspires to be and gives Georgia fans a rooting interest. Obviously, a tough end of the season for the Dogs in the Sugar Bowl, but now you got the Philly Dogs in the Super Bowl. And I would bet you that at least 95% of the Georgia fans are going to be rooting for the Eagles in this game.
Yeah, so going through all 6 of them, you got Lewis Cine, who was kind of a free agent pickup in mid-year for the Eagles. He was, of course, on that 2021 national championship team as safety. Then you got Nakobe Dean, unfortunately, out for the Super Bowl. His season ended with a knee injury, but he's back closer to home. He's from Mississippi, and the game being played here in New Orleans this week. Of course, big Jordan Davis in the middle of that Eagles defense. He's making an impact, but 2 guys that have really stood out in this playoffs. Jalen Carter, he stood out all season long. 8 hurries of the quarterback in the NFC Championship game last week. And then you got Nolan Smith, who has 4 sacks in the playoffs, and Keely Ringo as well. But Nolan Smith, I'm excited to just get a microphone in front of him because I have a feeling he's always great when he's on camera.
Well, Nolan's great, and you're right. He was an emotional leader for the team. But when I think about the national championship teams, I think the cornerstone player, the one guy that made all the difference was Jordan Davis. His decision to come back for another year, he and Devontae Wyatt, remember they made that decision together. It was about Jordan Davis. He was the leader of that team. He was the guy that everybody rallied around, everybody loved, really bridged the gap between Kirby Smart and his hard driving ways and the players. And the way he responded to Kirby, everyone else followed suit. And the other guy that I think was the MVP of the 2021 win over Alabama was Jalen Carter. If he doesn't block that field goal, remember, that's when it all turned around. Yeah. He blocks an Alabama field goal attempt. Next play, James Cook goes 67 yards, and Georgia finally gets a touchdown at the end of the third quarter. That offense was struggling terribly for 3 quarters. And if that defense hadn't been keeping Bryce Young out of the end zone for 3 quarters, it might have been over with by then. So when I think about the Georgia National Championships, for me, I think Jordan Davis is a guy that I think was the cornerstone of that. I think obviously Brock Bowers, to me, the most irreplaceable player. You mentioned Nolan Smith, an emotional leader. Keely Ringo, the big clutch interception. Don't sleep on Lewis Cine. I mean, this guy is special. He's come back from a broken leg. Really great to see him now with the Philly Dogs ready to put out as well. And yeah, Nakobe's out, but everybody knows he's the leader on that defense from the Mike linebacker position.
On the other side, you got the Chiefs. I got a couple of former Dogs on the Chiefs. Malik Herring, of course, out of Mary Persons. He is on the pretty much a practice squad guy, but has made an impact over the last couple of years for the Chiefs. And then, of course, McCole Hardman, who is out for this game, out for the rest of the season, but who scores in the game-clinching touchdown last year in the Super Bowl to put his name, Bowman, Georgia, on the map there. So we'll have a lot of content on our DawgNation YouTube channel of all the stuff we get tonight at Super Bowl Media Week, and we'll have it kind of throughout the week as we lead up to the big game. But we, on this show, we're going to talk Georgia football, and really interesting to me, and we're actually going to talk more SEC because I think you've got a great perspective, Mike, being in this league for so many years. And the one thing that kind of stuck out to me, now we've kind of slowed, the coaching carousel has pretty much slowed down. Now we do have, some guys going off, offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb, of course, going, and then you've got Chip Kelly going from Ohio State, of course, the NFL. But for the most part, the head coaches have slowed down. And at the end of this year, for the first time in like 6 years, no SEC coaches were fired. And you also had no SEC teams in the championship game for the 2nd straight year. So my question to you, Mike, have we gone soft? Are we just not firing anybody anymore?
No, I don't think it's a matter of going soft. I think the SEC was as good as it's ever been, as deep as it's ever been. I mean, when you're 0-8 team, Mississippi State's able to play the Dogs within 10 points between the hedges and throw for 300 yards. I mean, and play the Big 12 champion Arizona State within 7 at their place. I mean, this league was deep. It was rough. The SEC cannibalized itself. And, this national narrative that, oh gosh, the SEC's jumped the shark, it is so false and it is so flawed. But there's a lot of jealousy. There's a lot of conferences out there that have been waiting to take their shots at the SEC. And yeah, Georgia was playing with a backup quarterback and didn't have their best efforts. We know there was a lot going on in New Orleans for Kirby Smart, as well as the team. And Texas ran into a really good Ohio State team that played really well in the playoff. Cody, I'm going to throw something back at you here. I know you usually ask the questions, but I'm going to throw this one at you. When I was down there at the Senior Bowl, Ty Ingram Dawkins was talking. He made the comment that it's harder to win the SEC championship than the national championship. And I had to stop and really think about it. Ohio State finished 4th in the Big Ten. Could Ohio State have won the SEC with Georgia's schedule? I think Ty Ingram Dawkins might have been onto something there.
The thing is, because the way the SEC championship game is, you can't lose a lot of games and even get to the game. So just to get to the SEC championship is really hard. And then, of course, you've got to beat a really good SEC team in that championship game. Now, to Ohio State's credit, they did beat 2 SEC teams on the way to the national championship, but they weren't. One of them was the top 2, but Tennessee was not one of the top 2 teams in the SEC. So I can see that argument. I don't think nationally it's going to hold. I don't think people are just kind of brush it off if you live in Big Ten country or you live somewhere else. But I think people in the South realize that, yeah, just to get to the SEC championship game is a feat in itself because you can't afford to lose games along the way.
And I think that's what Georgia fans need to remind themselves of. When we hear people saying this was an off year because Georgia lost 3 games, you say, my goodness, you have to look closer and recognize what happened to the Georgia Bulldogs this year and what the SEC was like and how tough it was. I mean, Georgia beat Texas twice, and both times I thought was more impressive than how Ohio State beat Texas. Now, the final score says 2 touchdowns, but that was a 1-score game until late when Ohio State had that turnover for a touchdown. So I would say Georgia was arguably more impressive against Texas, just as impressive against Tennessee. Ohio State also beat Notre Dame, which Georgia didn't. That's probably the one difference. But again, the Buckeyes didn't even play in their conference championship game. So I think we can't read too much into the playoffs. It was the first year of the 12-team playoff. I think Georgia, in hindsight, probably got a pretty tough draw. Would you rather have had Penn State's draw maybe and gotten to play SMU, instead of Notre Dame in your first game? I think so. So I think Georgia fans really need to remind themselves of what this season was all about and really covet that SEC championship game because it was tough for them to get there. It was tough for them to win it. And I think it's important to put that banner up. And I think this was a season of achievement, even if it didn't end the way we'd become accustomed to with this ridiculous 7-game bowl streak that Georgia had that went all the way back to 2018.
So if the SEC, we didn't get firings this year because you say so many teams were up. I think there are other things, obviously, that figured into no firings is you got a lot of really big buyouts, and not everybody is willing to spend that money in some of those places. And some of these coaches just in their first couple of years. And I do think part of the reason that no coaches got fired is because there's now a 12-team playoffs. Teams don't feel like you got to be the top 4 or it's not even worth it. Now you can be in the top 12, and they feel like they have more of a chance maybe than they ever have before. But as we're going to start to rank some of these SEC coaches, I think we can probably do it in chunks, just kind of tiers, because you start arguing this guy's ahead of this guy. But I think in big chunks is probably the easier way to do it. Now, we can start. I think there's definitely some coaches, Mike, who are going to start this year on the hot seat, and we are going to see firings at the end of the next season.
I think so. But to finish your point that you made, I think NIL has a lot to do with this. You talked about the dollars that it takes to buy these coaches out. And these schools are saying, wait a minute, why do we want to spend $30,000 or $40,000 to buy out a coach when we're trying to build a roster, right? Or excuse me, $30 or $40 million to buy when we're trying to, it should be 30 or 4,000, but it's 30 or 40 million. I mean, this is just stupefying. Think about this, Cody. 30 and $40 million buyouts to not work. I mean, Jimmy Sexton has absolutely turned college football upside down. That has to end. At some point, that has to end. If you're wondering where the schools are going to get the money, and don't get me wrong, these coaches have a value. I'm not saying that they don't. But at some point, schools have got to bite the bullet and say, you know what? We can't afford to give that kind of buyout. And we can't afford to risk getting stuck with a coach. I think you're going to see the coaching salaries freeze a little bit at the top, and the buyouts shrink down because it just doesn't make sense with this new economical model that college football has before it. I'll be interested to hear your chunks of coaches. I've got my chunks already carved out and a few guys that I think will be on the hot seat.
All right, so hot seat, I'm thinking for sure. And some hot seat may not be the bottom tier, I guess, necessarily, but Sam Pittman's still going to be on the hot seat after last year. I think, of course, you have Bobby Petrino come in and kind of help them out. They got to 7-6 this year, so he kept his job. Billy Napier, I think, still going to be on the hot seat, and the expectations are a little bit higher for Billy Napier this year after what DJ Lagway did in the few games he got to play. Mark Stoops is one of those buyout guys who knows if they hadn't had, what is it, a $44 million buyout. They go 4-8 this year. He's definitely be on the hot seat. And we'll throw in a coach who's probably not in the bottom tier, but Kalen DeBoer, if things don't make the playoff next year, you got that seat's heating up a little bit, right?
Well, Coach Spurrier said, now this was before DeBoer was hired, when I asked him, how long do you think the next guy will last? And Spurrier said probably 2 or 3 years. Because if he wins, he's going to realize the challenge and he's going to move on to the NFL. And if he loses, to your point, they're not going to tolerate it. So I didn't really think about Kalen DeBoer being on the hot seat, but if it's bad enough, when I say bad enough, that means missing the playoffs again. I think you may be onto something, especially if they've got another candidate in mind. The name you didn't mention, Cody, and I'm just shocked, is Hugh Freeze. I think the seat's got to be hotter on Hugh Freeze than anybody. Sam Pittman, I want to believe he's got more job security, but you're probably right. I know they talked about that this year. I don't like to talk about it because I'm just such a big Sam Pittman fan, and I got to think he seems like such a good fit for Arkansas. You know, I had a chance to visit with Billy Napier at the Senior Bowl, and I went to introduce myself, and he said, "Oh, I know who you are." And I guess he supposed that he probably does. I'm just the guy that said what everybody else was saying and thinking, that he was going to be fired, because he was going to be fired. And to give Billy Napier credit, he turned it around, Cody. But hey, those Gator fans haven't forgotten the beginning of last year. Now, they finished out the year strong, but they're going to have a strong start to next year. And people down there in Florida, they expect to contend for championships. And I don't know. I think a lot of DJ Lagway, just to be clear. But are the Gators ready to compete for a playoff spot? Because if that's where the bar is set, I think it's going to be hard for them. You're right about Mark Stoops. I think Kentucky's tired of him, and I think he's tired of Kentucky. But this buyout that you brought up has kept him tied up. And the basketball coach better start winning to give him enough of a distraction. Otherwise, they're going to be right back on top of Mark Stoops. And there's not going to be a Brock Vandegrift there to save the day and help him beat a team like Ole Miss and give him a few highlights. So I'm with you. I agree with you on the hot seat coaches. I can't really add anyone. I think we've named them all.
All right, so let's go back to the top and just go with that top tier. So to me, obviously, head coach in Athens is right up there. 3 SEC championships, 2 national championships, 105-19 Kirby Smart. Right now, his record at Georgia. I think Steve Sarkisian has put his team in the Final Four the last 2 years. He's got to be up there. I do think he's one of those people. If he succeeds again next year, has a really good year, I think the NFL could come calling for him. And I'll throw Lane Kiffin in that top tier as well, although they hadn't made the playoff yet and just missed it this year. And they kind of always have an inexplicable loss. But I'll put Lane Kiffin up there. And that's probably it for my really top tier.
I was a little different. I think Kirby's kind of in a league of his own from the other coaches. So
Okay.
he's the elite, right? And then I think you have 3 very good coaches. And I'm with you. I'm going to put Sarkisian in there, even though you could argue he had a lot of talent and really didn't win anything this year when you think about it. They didn't win the SEC. I guess they won, one playoff game
Beat
in
Clemson,
overtime.
yeah.
2. They beat Clemson and they beat Arizona State. But, whoop-de-doo. With all the talent that they had, to me, and I said this, for me to really accept Texas in the SEC, and they needed to earn their stripes and beat Ohio State, and they didn't do it. So I'm not ready to give Texas full-fledged SEC status. Lane Kiffin, yes, I thought he did a good job this year. The Georgia win was very impressive. Had a lot of talent, though, and I actually thought Ole Miss probably would have been the most dangerous SEC team in the playoff had they gotten there, because of the explosivity of their offense and their front 7 and pass rush and how healthy they were. This may be controversial, but I think Brian Kelly belongs there. I mean, he coached a Heisman Trophy winner. They played in the SEC championship game. They put up more than 30 points, really outplayed Georgia in the first quarter of that SEC title game. Now, Georgia turned it around and put 50 on the Tigers that day. But, Brian Kelly inherited a situation that wasn't real good. and got LSU competitive again. And right now, a lot of people are saying LSU's the favorite in the SEC next year because of Nussmeier. So I'm going to put Brian Kelly in that second good tier. So Kirby Smart 1, and then Brian Kelly, Steve Sarkisian, and Lane Kiffin 2, 3, and 4.
I do think Brian Kelly, I look at what Jaden Daniels is doing in the NFL. I'm like, he had the Heisman winner, right? And like could have done more. And then also, I think his seat could start getting hot too if things don't. And now their expectations are really high in Baton Rouge next year. I think that could be interesting. All right, so my next little tier, I got to go with Shane Beamer, Eli Drinkwitz, Josh Heupel, Kalen DeBoer. They're all kind of jumbled in there together for me. And Brian Kelly will probably be in there for me as well. And you could argue Mike Elko, but not yet. So that's kind of my next little mid-tier.
Yeah, I got Beamer in there and Heupel and DeBoer and Eli Drinkwitz as well. I got a couple more guys in there. I'm going to have to put Clark Lee in there. Now, I don't know that I thought he belonged as SEC Coach of the Year. I mean, he lost his last 3 games. I thought maybe Kirby Smart did a pretty good job. But I guess, as the voters say, well, he's supposed to win. That's what they get. Well, he's supposed to win. Okay, well, historically and in fashion like no one else has, with 3 straight undefeated SEC seasons completely overlooked, back-to-back national championships no one else ever did in the playoff era. But I digress. And this one will surprise you. I really believe Brent Venables is a good coach. Now, I know Oklahoma didn't show it, but here's another coach that I think had a lot on him when he took on that program. And there was a lot of young guys playing for Oklahoma. I think Oklahoma is a sleeper next year. So I'm going to get out in front of the pack. I like to do that. And I'm going to put Brent Venables on tier 2 of our coaching list.
Second losing season in 3 years for Oklahoma. I do think if that's another losing season, I feel we said that with everybody, but I think people start looking at that, but it's kind of a prove it year for Brent Venables coming up as well. And then for me, the rest of them, Jeff Lebby yet to prove anything, has had 1 year at Mississippi State. Like you said, played teams really tough, and I think he's a great offensive mind. So you could put that. Clark Lee did, he brought in Diego Pavia, right? Like, so that's on him. So I do think he belongs up there. The rest of the guys are all kind of those guys that we talked about on the hot seat. Hugh Freeze really just hadn't proven it yet. He's one of those guys who had a couple of good seasons at Ole Miss, but his overall career, I think he's pretty close to 500, so hasn't proven it yet. I think we've mentioned a little bit of everybody in there so far. Do you feel like there's anybody else too that's lower than maybe people think they are?
Well, I'm going to add this qualifier on Brent Venables and Clark Lee, and this is going to be maddening, and it's probably not the right thing to say on the show, but they beat Alabama. And Kirby Smart didn't. And it's mind-boggling to think of it that way. And granted, Vanderbilt and Oklahoma had Alabama at home, but it's just mind-blowing to me that Vanderbilt and Oklahoma were able to beat Alabama and Georgia wasn't. Now, we can relive that game. Most of us don't want to. And understand there were a lot of crazy things that happened that night. But that, to me, gives those guys a little badge of honor. I think if you beat Georgia or you beat Alabama, you get my respect. I mean, because to me, those 2 teams are the standard. Texas, they play 2 teams with a winning record in the league and lost to Georgia. I guess they beat A&M. Those were the only 2 over 500 conference teams they played in league play. My third tier is Freeze, Pittman, and Napier. I think these are pretty good coaches who haven't done good enough yet. Freeze has played some teams close. You mentioned, that he did well at Ole Miss. He beat Kirby there. Remember, he played Kirby and Georgia within a touchdown, not this past season, but the year before. Georgia's got to be going back down there to Auburn next year. We'll see what Freeze does with a quarterback. He kept throwing his quarterback under the bus. I do think this guy can coach him up, but he has yet to do that at Auburn. That's why he's on that tier. Sam Pittman, a guy, has a couple of nice wins in there. You mentioned he's got Bobby Petrino. I think that's a big hire, but can Sam get the players at Arkansas? That's a challenge. And Billy Napier. I mean, the Gators really turned it on the second half of the season and, beat Ole Miss, really knocked Ole Miss out of the playoff. And if I'm not mistaken, that put Georgia in the SEC championship game. So maybe a thank you note from Georgia fans there to Billy Napier. And then I go to the bottom. I was really disappointed with Mike Elko. I don't know how else to say it. A&M got hot for a minute, looked like they, maybe peaked too soon and didn't peak for very long. So to me, that was a very disappointing first year for Mike Elko. We talked about Mark Stoops. I mean, solid coach, but just in a terrible situation. I think we've seen the best Kentucky can do. I think they had, a 10-win season 1 year, and that's about all you're going to do at a basketball school. And then Jeff Lebby, and it may be unfair, it was his first year, and he drew one heck of a difficult schedule, and they played well, but they didn't win. We got to win a game. So to me, those are the bottom three.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting that we get to SEC Media Days in Atlanta. That's the only event, by the way, SEC Media Days, that's bigger than this one is a little bit bigger than SEC Media Days, but it certainly gets you ready for the Super Bowl. Super Bowl was crazy. It's there's international people, Dutch people talking over here and German. It's just crazy to me how international football is at this level. But yeah, SEC Media Days, it's going to be all the same coaches, barring anything crazy. That we saw last year at SEC Media Days. First time since the end of the 2018 to 2019 season that all the coaches will be back. And it's now
Cody, do you want to lay early odds on who the 3 Georgia players will be that'll be at the SEC Media Days? A little sneak preview prediction here for the fans. Who comes to mind
SEC
for
Media
you?
Days.
I got to think that CJ Allen will be one of them.
CJ Allen, I think that's a great call.
Yeah. I don't think Nate Frazier's ready for the microphone yet.
I think Oscar Delp will be one.
Oscar Delp could be one. They typically like to bring a lineman. How about Christian Miller? Maybe that's part of the package for coming back for Christian Miller.
He was so fun with I would love to see him. I feel like a lot of the times Georgia goes super boring and those some of those guys they pull, so they don't want to make any. Kirby wants to get out there and make zero news the entire week. So I think Christian would be too much fun. So we'd have to get somebody pretty vanilla. I would love to hear from a KJ Bolden. I thought he was really good when we finally got to talk to him for the first time. They talked all year about how intelligent KJ Bolden is, and you really see that when you talk to him one-on-one. So I don't know. It could be a Dalen Everett too coming back again.
I could see Dalen Everett being there as well. I think that would be a good pick. How about Ernest Green?
Ernest Green could. I think the way last season ended with him, and we don't know how injured he was. I think he could be another good call. He's one of the stabilizing forces on that offensive line coming back this year.
Maybe Bell will be there.
I don't know if Coach. It depends on. We'll see how he feels in the spring. I don't think Coach wants him to have to face tough questions.
Would we agree that there won't be a Georgia quarterback there?
I think there's no way you bring Gunnar Stockton, even if he's. And I think it is clear that he's kind of the starter, but I don't think there's no reason to do that to him, especially because all his teammates love him, but he did not enjoy talking to us at all the Super Bowl events. It's just not in his nature. So I can see, and he's not trying to worry about his NIL either, right? He doesn't need his face out there. So I can see Gunnar not being there.
I'd be happy if they brought Brett Thorson. Now that'd be the comedy relief that we all would need, right? I think
that would be cool too. He's earned it too. Why not? I think Brett Thorson would be a good one for next year. All right, we're gonna take our first break here on the beat. When we come back, Mike was at the Senior Bowl last week in Mobile, and some dogs really stood out. We'll talk to him about that. But this is On the Beat, presented by Ingles.
It's the moment you dream of, the moment you work for, train for. Run wind sprints when nobody's watching for. The moment when hours of gym time, court time, prep time, all culminate into this time. The moment when millions of bounces, blocks, and boards all add up to this, your moment. Ingles, we're with you every step of the way.
Welcome back to On the Beat. I appreciate Ingles being a part of the show every week. And Mike, you had a road trip last week to get down to the Senior Bowl in Mobile. We had 6 dogs going down there, right? Ended up being 6. And a lot of guys were turning some heads, and the dogs were getting recognized by their teammates, which I really liked.
Yeah, only 5 ended up making it. Jared Wilson got hurt the day before. I don't know how much he got hurt, but a little bit of hurt when you're trying to get ready for the combine, substantial. And then Tate Ratledge, just kind of a surprise unknown scratch. I thought Tate could have really helped himself, because the guys that went down there, I think they all helped themselves. And to your point, they all looked good at different times. The guys probably helped themselves the most. I'd start with Dan Jackson. Dirty Dan, he loves that nickname, by the way. I always wondered, does he like that nickname? He said, I love it. He loves it. Eric Stokes started calling him that way back when. But Dan had a really good week. He started the game, played really well back there, had some big hits, really lit up Ollie Gordon, the Oklahoma State back. And that back was good 235. And Dan came up and put a pretty good lick on him in the open field. Also looked for him in an interception sought him out and, threw the body into him. So Thought Dan Jackson had a really good week. And Arian Smith. Now, Arian did have a couple drops, but made some really nice catches, ran some different kinds of routes. I think everybody saw how humble that he was and how easy he's going to be to work with for whatever team wants to roll the dice on that, world-class speed. Arian, may set a new combine record, Cody. I mean, this is a guy that can run the 40 in a low 4.2 range.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see Jim Nagy tweeting out that Dan Jackson was voted the top safety on the American squad from the tight ends and wide receivers he went against all week on the practice field. And that tells you, like, when you're getting the respect of those guys, that tells me so much more than what, the dorky writer in the stands is seeing and what he's writing about who had a great week and who didn't. And what a thing we talked about it with Jim on this show about how Dan can go down there and really help his stock and what Jim saw in Dan Jackson and why he wanted him a part of that game. And how about him for going out and improving himself? North Hall High School, stand up.
Yeah, and let's keep an eye out for the Las Vegas Raiders. Pete Carroll is back in charge of the Raiders. You mentioned Chip Kelly a second ago. He gets that Brock Bowers toy to play with there in that Raiders offense. But don't be surprised if Vegas isn't one of the teams that has interest in Dan Jackson based on, what Jim said. And I think Pete Carroll's a heck of a coach. I'm excited to see him back in the NFL. Trevor Etienne, another guy that was voted the best at his position by the opposing linebackers and safeties that faced him. I think we all saw how effective Trevor can be, maybe even a little underutilized at Georgia in the pass game. I would have liked to see the ball thrown to him more as it was. The guy scored all 5 touchdowns against Texas in those 2 games. I would say Georgia got their money's worth, and I would say Georgia doesn't win the SEC championship without Trevor Etienne. So he may not have gotten 1,000 yards, but I think he paid off for the Dogs. Almost came back. Word is that, when those Penn State running backs decided they were coming back for another year, Etienne saw that as an opportunity to move up in the draft another round, probably a late second to early third round pick. That's good enough money for him. He's proven what he needs to prove. Explain that to us down there. I got that one-on-one with him and, really appreciated Trevor taking that time and spelling that out for us. But Smile Munden was another guy. Just needed to show the NFL that foot is right. Now, we saw it. From the Tennessee game on, he played like his hair was on fire. He was outstanding. Kirby said he played his best game against Dak, and Smile was all over the field, sideline to sideline. Ty Ingram Dawkins, he actually played more defensive line snaps than any other Georgia player, but that defensive end spot, Cody, so hard to stand out at that spot. Thought Ingram Dawkins flashed well at times. You can see the athleticism and the upside. That's why he got the Senior Bowl invite, and Warren Brinson and Nazir Stackhouse didn't. They ended up at the East-West Shrine Bowl.
So it's kind of like the event that we'll have tonight here at the Super Bowl with Media Night, where you get to kind of talk to guys away from this formal press conference setting. So we talked about that last week, how we were kind of excited for you to go talk to some of these guys a little bit looser than they have been before. So what stood out to you when you got to talk to some of these dogs one-on-one?
The commitment to Georgia. I mean, just you get to talk to these guys out of uniform, and they're not in Butts-Mehre Heritage Hall where they got to, stand up there like Marines and say all the right things. And they're just people, right? They're just down-to-earth guys that really give their heart to Georgia. They all love Kirby. They all respect him. They're all brothers. They went through a lot of adversity together. They stuck together. And, yeah, we had a headline that said they were pissed off about losing to Notre Dame. That was the word Dirty Dan said. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That's how they feel. And I think fans need to recognize it. Sometimes you forget that. You watch the game, you say, oh, man, that hurts so bad. That bothered. Well, just imagine how those guys felt. They knew that it wasn't their best performance. They knew it was an outlier kick return, first one in 6 years. They knew those fumbles caused by missed blocks didn't have to be missed. It was just a tough day. And to look into those guys' eyes and see the pain and the hurt that they came so far and overcame so much, they hated ending on that note. And every one of them talked about the guys next year and how hard they're going to work and how they got to realize every rep's going to count. And I don't want to say that it was necessary to lose every now and then in the postseason to get a reminder, but you better believe this is going to be a very difficult and challenging offseason over there at Georgia. Kirby Smart is going to turn the heat up because those dogs didn't finish the way he wanted. You remember Pollock saying all these guys were going to transfer? He wasn't pulling that out of thin air. He knew what kind of vibe Kirby Smart was putting out for these guys. Don't bother showing back up if you ain't going to leave it all on the field next season.
We didn't see nearly the numbers of transfers that we thought, was going to be there. So maybe that does tell you about the character of these guys, and they are the right guys in the room. Because that, to me, I read your article, DawgNation.com, where when Dan says I'm pissed off, exactly what I want to hear if I'm a Georgia fan, right? Like, be mad about it because that's not cool. And then to him also to say, I know exactly those guys in that room and what they're doing this offseason. That is so good to hear, and exactly what you wanted to hear from the guys who are leaving the program.
Yeah, and Smile, identifying, we see Chris Cole and we say, hey, he's pretty good. And Smile's like, no, this guy's a freak athlete. And then he's telling us about Riddell, the tight end. He says, this guy's going to, we've been hearing that too. But when you hear it from a guy that's been across from in scrimmages and practices every single day, it carries more weight. And then Munden confirming what you and I talked about earlier in the show about KJ Bolden, that hit on Phil Mufa in the opening game in the open field, when little KJ, that little freshman, that little 185-pound freshman, took down that senior grown man, 235-pound Clemson back. I mean, that's when I was like, wow, I don't know what they did to get KJ Bolden, but thank goodness he did. I think KJ Bolden is an absolute rock star. You go back and look at the grading from Pro Football Focus Network. He graded out higher than Malachi Starks throughout the years. So KJ Bolden star really on the rise. And then Arian Smith saying, you know what, Bell's going to be back with a vengeance. He wants to shut these people up and I'm one of them because I've been calling out those receivers all year. So yeah, show me, show everyone else, because the Dog fans are ready to see the receivers put on a show and catch these passes consistently.
Yeah, shut Mike up next year. That nothing could be greater than that. So as we get closer to the draft, the next thing will be the combine. It'll be interesting to see how many Dogs get invited to the combine this year. That's coming up at the end of this month. And when you talk about kind of turning from the Senior Bowl guys who were mid to late round type of guys into the NFL combine, we keep seeing the mock drafts out there where you've got Michael Williams, Jalen Walker. Malachi Starks, I think, is one of those guys who, because of this season, I think going into last season, he was just going to be a first rounder no matter what. I think it now really matters how he tests at the combine. He's got to test well to keep his stock up a little bit. And then the fourth guy I've seen coming off the boards is Jared Wilson, being the #1 overall center. So even with that missing the Senior Bowl and a little bit of an injury here, excited to see what he can do at the combine to kind of boost his stock a little bit. So those are kind of the top tier guys, but they're going to be a lot more than that invited to the combine in Indianapolis.
Yeah, by my count, I think there'll be 14, right? Because, well, let's see, maybe 15, because you had 7 guys invited to the Senior Bowl and 6 guys invited East-West Shrine. That's 13, and throw in maybe a couple more that we're not counting on. So I'd say at least 13 guys will be there. And you're right about Malachi Starks. Talking to some NFL people, I mean, we all see the All-American numbers, but he played a lot of different positions. He was asked to do a lot, but he was a step off at times, and I don't think he was quite as sharp. Now, he did have more on his shoulders because Georgia had just lost 3 top 100 players to the NFL, right? Javon Bullard and Tyke Smith and Lassiter. So there was more on Malachi, but I think it exposed a few things. So he's going to need to run and jump and show that great athleticism. I think he will. I think he'll work his way back into the end of the first round. Michael Williams, obviously the physical is going to be important. They do these medical checks. He had some injuries. He's been kind of on the field, off the field throughout his career. Are you going to invest for how high of a first round pick? Do you want to invest in a guy with an injury history like that hasn't stayed on the field? I think Jalen Walker is the one guy that's a slam dunk to go in the first half of the first round.
Can you imagine how good Jalen Walker is going to be in the interviews with GMs? He's the son of a coach, right? So he just understands that world. He's going to be so good. And that will seal him, I think, being one of those very early, maybe top 10 picks in this year's NFL draft. So we'll have a lot more on that. Mike and Kaylee make another road trip out to the combine coming up at the end of February. We'll have a lot more leading on that. All right, we're going to talk a little Georgia basketball here in a moment because Mike built up. We talked about the Dogs last week, and we'll kind of recap, but we'll do that right after we talk first about Daytona Beach. We're happy to have Daytona Beach being a sponsor of what we're doing here on DawgNation. Daytona Beach is a special place. It's where I grew up going as a child, whether it was a Ponce Inlet lighthouse down there, and I've gone back as a professional covering NASCAR and being down there for so many things. 23 miles of Atlantic shoreline. You can sit there on the beach. You can go to the boardwalk. You can also do some fishing, some kayaking, play some golf down there, or just be a spectator at the Daytona 500. Appreciate Daytona Beach being a sponsor. If you want to find the best deals on your next trip down to Daytona Beach, you can go to DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals to get all the deals you can, figuring out spring break and summer plans. That's what we're all trying to do right now. So go to DaytonaBeach.com/hotel deals. All right, Mike, we talked about it's didn't want us to give up on this Georgia basketball team last week, said it's been a tough stretch. They played some really good teams. Well, they bounced back and got one win over what we called a must win. Had to beat South Carolina last week. They got that done. But then they go and lose by 21 to Alabama over the weekend. But I think it really kind of sets up a make or break week. You can't make yourself into the tournament this week, but you can definitely fall out of the tournament this week. They've got LSU at home on Wednesday, another home game against number 14 Mississippi State next weekend.
Yeah, you got to take care of business on your home court. I mean, that's the formula, right, Cody? You got to take care of business at home and try to steal a couple on the road. They haven't stolen any on the road in SEC play yet. They're going to have some opportunities later this year to play some unranked teams, believe it or not. Because when you look at Georgia's resume, so many of these teams are top 10 teams that they're playing. And even within the 21-point loss to Alabama, there was some encouraging signs. And I know that sounds crazy. When you look at the turnovers, Georgia only turned the ball over 6 times, forced 20 Alabama turnovers. Now, normally you see that turnover ratio and you go, oh my gosh, they had to win. Well, no, because they didn't shoot the ball well. They shot less than 50% from the free throw line and less than 25% from three. And to me, that's practice time, because I think the talent is there. I think these guys got in the gym, got to get in the gym. I know Athens is an exciting town, Cody. I get it. But you got to put in the gym time. That's what separates the good from great teams. And there's a lot of great teams in the SEC, historically great at this point. 12 teams projected in the NCAA tournament. That would be a record. That would beat the record set by the Big East of 11. So you are seeing a historically good basketball league. It is a good Georgia basketball team, but this thing's on a curve, and you got to play all these ranked teams. So you're right. They got to beat that 1-7 LSU team at 9 p.m. on a Wednesday. That's a tough ask to fill up Stegman Coliseum on a 9 p.m. on a weeknight. Then they got to come home. Mississippi State, they've slid to 22, still a very capable team. Got to beat the Maroon Bulldogs Saturday in Stegman Coliseum, because next week it's tough. At number 10, Texas A&M, and then you got number 15, Missouri. You got to try to steal one of those as well. So Dogs still projected as a fringe NCAA tournament team, but need to win the games they're supposed to and steal one more somewhere along the line.
Take care of business. You talked about it. 423 shooting 3-pointers against Alabama is not going to get it done. It kind of reminds me of the drops we talked about with the football team all year. Is it just a matter of repetition in practice?
That's a really good analogy, because you got to do a lot of things right to win games. But if you do certain things wrong, you're not going to win. You got to put the ball in the hole at the end of the day. Now, I'll say this. They didn't get a very friendly whistle there. And I'll give Mike White credit. He's a bit of a Boy Scout over there. Maybe too nice for his own good sometimes, I think. But he managed to get tee up. I don't know what he said. I can't imagine, because Mike White is, like I said, he's pretty much a Boy Scout over there. It's hard to imagine him getting a technical foul. But that's how bad it was for Mike to get a technical. And he's standing up for this team. He loves this team. He loves these players. These guys are determined, Cody. They want to change the narrative of Georgia basketball. Everybody's saying, oh, it's the same old Georgia. I don't think it is the same old Georgia. Now, they got a steeper hill to climb because of how good this league is. And John Calipari even said it. He says you're going to lose 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4, 3 in a row, because that's the league. And he said it after he just beat Kentucky. So when Coach Cal's telling you that, it means something. That's a veteran. That's a guy that's been there and done it. I don't think he's trying to snow anybody over, but that's how rough it really is in the league. Big challenge for the Dogs, and you're right. I think this is a make or break week, and making it just means staying alive, and that means winning 2 home games.
All right, good stuff there. We're going to finish on a football note, and something we haven't talked about yet, and so I'm interested to hear what you have to say. It's kind of a national story, but you always have such a great perspective. Matt Rule making some waves this week, saying he's canceling his spring football game because he doesn't want to advertise all his players to all the other folks who want to pick him out for transfers. How do you feel about Matt Rule just canceling his spring game because he doesn't want everybody picking off his players?
Wow, to me, that's a dangerous trend. Spring football is another one of those college football traditions that, I think the fans enjoy. They really don't get much access anymore. And to me, the spring football was the opportunity to do that. I hope Nebraska's at least doing an autograph day or something like that. I know Georgia used to do those. Maybe Kirby will bring those back now, just so the fans can see, just so the players can see just how much they mean to the fans and what the program means. We've seen Kirby do that before. To me, that's a dangerous precedent. I don't like that. I think Matt Rule's using up a little bit of equity by doing that. He's a popular coach, but boy, Nebraska don't underestimate Nebraska. I'll tell you, that's one of the places when I covered the Big Ten, I said, this place has SEC intensity and SEC class. I hate that he's doing that to the fan base. I'm sure just like at Georgia. If you donate enough money, you get behind the scenes and you get to see the players, but you can't just do it with the big donors. There's a lot of common fans that are out there representing your brand, traveling for miles and miles and miles and making that commitment, spending a lot of money. And I'm going to make a quick detour here. Matthew Stafford. Did you read about the Matthew Stafford gesture, Cody?
Fill us in.
So Matthew Stafford heard about a Detroit Lions fan that sold an old Stafford autographed jersey so he could take his daughter to the Lions playoff game. So Matthew Stafford, way out there in Los Angeles, displaced from his home, dug out an old jersey from when he played for the Lions, autographed it, and sent it to that guy. Now tell me, that was one heck of a class gesture. I'd at least have sent him a Rams jersey and said, hey, follow me now. But no, Stafford finds a game-worn jersey from an 11-win season and says, you know what? I like what you did for your kid. I'm going to replace that jersey you had to sell to go watch the Lions lose to the Commanders in the playoffs.
It sure is a class move. And, it's so interesting because Stafford has gone on to LA and won a Super Bowl, but he still has such a soft place in his heart for a place that he started, which wonders because he's got to have a soft place in his heart for Georgia fans too, as well. Although he did make news last year saying he doesn't like hearing people call the Dogs, but he obviously, Detroit means a lot to him. I'm sure Athens does too. And I'm sure we will see him once he retires back in Athens a little more.
Well, let me clean that up a little bit. He said he has a hard time with the barking in his face and yelling it back. He said he had to do a better job with it. So it wasn't like he said, I'm not going to say it. Now, I know Georgia fans took that personal, but Matthew Stafford's not that guy to bark in public. If you haven't noticed, he's a pretty laid back, chill guy. If you're a Georgia fan and you go up to him, I guarantee you're going to get an autograph and a smile because he loves the Dogs, and his wife Kelly was a cheerleader here, and they've got a great history. They've donated money to the university for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we'll see more of Matthew Stafford at Georgia after he retires. Unquestionably the most talented quarterback to ever play at Georgia, number 1 overall draft pick. Mike Bobo certainly lists him high on the resume.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, yeah, it was a really cool gesture, and thank you for bringing that story up because that is the great way to end this episode of On the Beat. As we said, we'll be at Super Bowl Media Night tonight talking to those Philly Dogs. We'll have everything for you on our DawgNation YouTube channel. Maybe we'll have some boots on the ground next week from what I find at this Super Bowl Media Night, so that'll be kind of fun. But appreciate, Mike, we kind of broke down the SEC coaches, which is kind of a nod to your SEC power rankings that you did all season long. So that was really fun to do. We'll find some more things as we get in the offseason here and find some other big topics that Mike covered this league for decades now. We'll have plenty to talk about. So appreciate you, Mike. It's been a great week. We'll have more from Super Bowl Media Night. I keep wanting to say SEC Media Days because that's what it keeps reminding me of. But Super Bowl Media Night coming up on our DawgNation YouTube channel. But for now, we will see you next week right back here on The Beat.